Hello, I'm Bob the Bookerer and welcome to my channel. Today I am just going over the books that I read this week and talking a little bit about them. And as you may be able to tell from both my voice and from the fact that I have more than one or two books to talk about this week, I'm getting a lot better and I feel a lot more human. My brain is coming back, which is all that I needed. So yeah, very grateful. And thank you very much for people who left very lovely messages about hoping I got well soon. So yeah, thank you. Much appreciated. Very, very kind of you all. So thank you. I'm going to get started with these books. And it's been quite a fun reading week. A couple of sort of chunkers, I guess, in there. And let's get talking about them. So first up, I did a separate video about this book, but just to talk about it here again, just sort of as part of the weekly wrap up. I read Osebol by Marit, Kapla and translated by Peter Graves. And this book looks a lot longer really than it is. So it's about 800 pages, but actually many of the pages are incredibly sort of light on text. So essentially this book is it's sort of a non-fiction book kind of woven into a bit of a narrative. And essentially the way that this book is framed and themed and all of that kind of jazz is that there were a series of interviews done with people who lived and or live in a village called Osebol in Sweden. And those people were interviewed just a little bit about what their lives have been like, how they think about the village, how they think about how things have changed and all of those sorts of things. So you get these really interesting perspectives, sometimes from people who have been living in that village for 40, 50, 60 years, sometimes people who have only moved in the last few years, sometimes people who live between a bigger city and this village. And so you get these really fascinating snapshots into lives around this village. So sometimes people say all of those typical things that you tend to expect when reflecting on the past of, you know, oh, it used to be very different in my day and it used to be a lot safer and our kids are a little bit more insular and spending time on their phones all the time and all that kind of those conversations. You also get people talking a lot about how they've made a conscious decision to move from the city to a village because they want that kind of peace and they want that ability to be around others and to have a sense of community. But then you also get some perspectives. I mean, and I sort of mentioned this a bit in the video that I did just on this book. Some bits that are a little bit less comfortable in some ways of, you know, some discussions in this book around immigration. And there are some people who have been there for a while who are saying, oh, you know, we need to look after our own first and blah, blah, blah. The difficulty I find with that in this book is that I don't think it's necessarily balanced out by having somebody say, you know, I suppose what I'm saying is those are opinions that some people have. And so, you know, this book hasn't really made a conscious decision, it seems, to take out really anything. It's sort of presented, here are what people are thinking, and it's a snapshot. And it's not sort of necessarily trying to craft a specific narrative. And so I get why that's included. Part of me just would have almost preferred that would then be, at least if that's going to be included, it's put alongside someone who's actually a recent immigrant to the village from further overseas, from perhaps outside of Europe, who can kind of comment on their experiences and kind of provide a little bit of nuance to that conversation. But either way, I think this is such a spellbinding book in so many ways. I found it really just a beautiful thing to sit and enjoy and let wash over me. And I think it's a really interesting book and well worth reading. Next up, I read Edouard Louis' History of Violence, translated by Lorin Stein. And so I did a video a couple of months ago, I think it was, about Edouard Louis and some of his other books, which I find really quite interesting in many, many ways. He is a French writer who writes a lot about class, masculinity, identity, belonging, and also a lot about the relationships he has with his parents and with other family members. And this book is probably, I'd say, of the four, I think probably the most difficult to stomach in some ways. It talks a lot about a very difficult moment in his life. History of Violence, the title gives you a bit of a hint, but essentially he experiences a really awful incident involving sort of physical and sexual violence, and he talks in this book about the sort of process of it, of not only what actually happened in the moment, but also what the aftermath has been in terms of reporting this, or in terms of processing it and thinking about it, even down to getting emergency medication to potentially stop transmission of HIV, and various other things that all go on in this book. And so for a relatively short book, I think about, just under 200 pages, it goes into a lot of detail about some of the really complicated factors around this. So part of that is that this man is sort of at least read, the perpetrator is read to people externally as not being French in a sort of typical way. He is read as Arab. Edouard Louis talks about how the police force, in talking about the reporting of this, suddenly seem much more interested when they perceive that this is an Arab man who's committed the acts, and therefore it sort of serves their agenda or their purpose a little bit as well. And so Edouard Louis, I think, in his book has this difficult balancing act of saying, yes, like, I have to acknowledge that this man was Arab, but also, like, that was not a deciding factor. Like, he committed an awful act, but actually let's take out the sort of institutional racism and sort of the way the police force responded to it, and actually let's focus a little bit on some of the other aspects of it. So a really complicated, nuanced book in some ways, a really difficult, challenging read, but I think a really important one in many, many ways. And I think it also adds a little bit of added context to some of the conversations in some of Edouard Louis' other books, where he talks a little bit about the complicated relationship that he often has with his identity and his sexuality, and talking to his family about it, because incidents like this sometimes for his family seem to confirm some of their biases or judgments, even though it's a deeply unfair thing that's going on there. So a really, really complicated and nuanced book, but a really important one, I think. Next up, I read Handiwork by Sara Baume, and I'm sort of on a bit of a Sara Baume kick at the moment. I read Seven Steeples by her a couple of months ago, and it ended up being one of my favourite books of last year. And I wanted to go and read more of hers because I just absolutely loved what I'd read. And I'm in the process of currently reading another one of hers now. But Handiwork is a non-fiction book that looks at her process of creation, sort of how Sara Baume not only writes, but also physically makes things, and her sort of artistic process. And whereas on the surface, that sounds at first like it's going to be quite pretentious, I think this book skirts that really nicely, because it's a real love of her craft. She talks a lot about, for example, making these wooden birds, which you can sort of see on the cover. And she includes pictures of them in the book itself, so sort of like that. And she talks a lot about the creative process for her with those birds, being that, she makes like 100 of them, and not all of them are perfect. There'll be something that's quite wrong, and she's searching for the exact thing that is right. So sometimes she'll acknowledge that the eyes she's drawn on one bird are really good, but actually another marking that she's made isn't, or doesn't fit this sort of perfect image she has in her mind of it. And she compares a lot of that to the creative process itself, that there's a hunger and a desire to create perfection, or to fully realize an image that's in your brain, but that doesn't often come out. And actually the important bit is the getting up every day and committing to the thing, doing the thing, and creating something. And I found it really interesting as a result of that. I thought it was a really beautiful little book, that really hones in on sort of the tensions, I guess, at the heart of trying to create something. Of you are battling, a sort of an external pressure to sort of be productive and to be perfect and create this thing and make a living from it, and all of these other things, with the fun of play, that sometimes it's just really enjoyable to make things, and actually the important thing is making something regardless. And so I just found this a really interesting book, particularly as someone who needs to get back on the horse of actually writing at the moment. It's quite a useful reminder to just have fun with it and to breathe a little. But I just love the way Sara Baume writes. I find her so engaging. The book I'm reading at the moment of hers, I'm just thoroughly enjoying as well. There's something about the very conversational and almost chatty quality of her work mixed with these really deep thoughts that I find so engaging. So I really love this really teeny little lovely book. Next up, I read Shahd Alshammari's Head Above Water, which was longlisted for the Barbellion Prize, a prize sort of by, with disabled writers and writers writing about disability. And this book I thought was really interesting in many ways. She talks a lot about how she sort of grows up sort of often a bit between cultures. She grows up especially dealing with some of the kind of expectations on her sort of being quite mixed and varied. So she talks about how she's at this sort of international school, and there's this sort of, she has these tensions between her mother tongue and English sometimes, but also as her disability sort of becomes more apparent in her life and, she's less able to move around, we get these interesting discussions where she becomes, she does a PhD and a doctorate whilst quite ill and really quite sort of struggling to find sometimes the energy and the access that she needs to be able to do what she needs to do. And then she becomes a teacher. And while she's lecturing and being a professor in English literature, she's teaching a group of pupils who are separated often by gender. And she talks a lot about how teaching classes of all men as a sort of, as a woman, talking about very specific things and being read as a woman who sometimes there are almost these added vulnerabilities, for want of a better word, because, she has some mobility needs. She can't often get around the class in the way that she would want to. And so sometimes she finds herself being read as weak. And so she has to assert herself in these very, very different ways. And I found her meditations on sort of the intersections, I guess, between her gender and her disability really interesting, in the way she articulates this sort of vision for what it would look like if some of those structural barriers were removed, what it would look like if actually we sort of used literature a bit more to engage with some of these concepts. So I thought this was a really interesting book. And I've just got one left now from the Barbellion long list, which I'm very excited to read as well. But yeah, I think a really intriguing book, and a perspective that I don't think we don't see as often in books as well. And last but not least, I read The Hungry Ghosts by Shyam Selvadurai. This book is set in Sri Lanka and Canada, and follows a young man called Shivan as he sort of articulates and sort of, not articulates, as he sort of goes through basically his many parts of his identity and really explores who he is, both as a young gay man, but also as a Sri Lankan in the middle of Sri Lankan conflict. So he grows up in Sri Lanka and moves to Canada. And early into the book, we get this sort of sense of his burgeoning sexuality. He sort of realizes a bit who he is, and his sexuality becomes this really complicated thing, because for him, he is in Canada and is sort of, everyone's telling him around like how lucky he is to be a gay man in Canada, but he experiences people who fetishize him because of his race, or ignore him because of his race. But also he is trying to do all of that whilst there are sort of various complicating factors. So he is he can't necessarily tell members of his family because they don't seem to fully understand. He's trying to work out what it means to be Sri Lankan in Canada, and sometimes that seems to him to be finding an expat community and really sort of a community of other Sri Lankans in Canada, and working with them to sort of understand who he is. But also his family around him are often trying to almost kind of get rid of anything Sri Lankan from their lives. They don't cook typical Sri Lankan food at home. They don't mix with other Sri Lankans in the neighborhood because they want to just be seen as Canadian and all of these sorts of things. So these really complicated factors come in. In the meantime, we have Shivan also go through quite a few complicated discussions around Sri Lanka itself. So he starts up a relationship in Sri Lanka at one point when he goes back to visit family. And in the meantime, he's had these really vicious, horrible arguments with his family. And there's a real everything's really quite dysfunctional around him. You know, nobody's really communicating properly with each other in his family. Everything is just sort of these really bitter arguments where people say, things that you can't take back. They say the most horrible things to each other. And when he's back in Sri Lanka and has this relationship, it's so fraught with danger, not only because of it being illegal in Sri Lanka, but also because it is also weaponized essentially by the government or, ruling parties, I guess, to conveniently get rid of anybody who they don't like. So if you're convicted or thought of as being gay, that is enough reason for the ruling party to be able to dispose of you and get you out of the way. And his partner is somebody working for a human rights NGO in Sri Lanka, who are a thorn in the side of this sort of government and ruling party. And so so much of his life is fraught with this danger constantly of, he's sometimes able to be really open and be himself. He sometimes absolutely cannot be. He doesn't always seem to get that as much as other characters. Other characters seem to understand that slightly more than he does. And by the time he often realizes it, it's quite late. And so he sort of bounds between Sri Lanka and Canada and is never really at home either way. He'll go home to Sri Lanka, he'll go home to Canada, can't really call either of them home, but doesn't really want to acknowledge that at times. And so he just has this, all of the relationships in his life are almost infected by this absolute breakdown in communication and everything else about saying the unsayable. And as a result, so many things in his life don't go the way they want. And it reminds me a fair bit of Bola by Pacem Statovici, in the sense of, there is a character at the heart of this who you really want to root for, but who is horrible on so many levels at so many times. And you kind of see where a lot of that is coming from. There's a self-preservation there. There's a cruelty that comes from just trying to do the damage before damage is done to you. And it's a hard read at times for that. But I did still think it was a really interesting book. And I think really delves into some of the depths of where some of these tricky things for characters can come from. So yeah, really, really interesting book. So those have been the books I read this week. An interesting blend, mostly just a lot of violence, really, and sort of discrimination and yeah. But I hope you've had a good week. I'm feeling a little bit more like I'm on the reading train again, as you can probably guess by these. But yeah, really keen to hear what you've been reading this week. I hope you've been doing really well. I hope you're keeping well despite the darkness and coldness of January, at least where I am. And yeah, speak to you all soon. I hope you're keeping well. Take care. Bye-bye.